We are going to begin our next panel on censorship in the sciences, free inquiry under pressure. And I'm going to introduce the chair, Abhishek Saha, who is a professor of mathematics at Queen Mary University, London, who writes widely on free speech and academic freedom for various outlets, including Quillette, The Critic, and The Times Higher Education. So I'll hand it over now.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here at this panel, which will focus on censorship in the sciences, by which we mean the censorship or suppression of the investigation of scientific questions or the publication or dissemination of scientific research for ideological or political reasons. And those science, because of its universalism and its focus on objective truth, is sometimes thought to be more resistant to this kind of politicization or censorship. It has a long history, the censorship of science, and today we see pressures on science, reason, and scholarship from multiple sources and restrictions on the free speech and academic freedom of scientists. And the main focus of this panel is to better understand some of these issues. So we have a very distinguished panel today, and let me introduce them in the order in which I will pose the opening questions to them. On my far right is Richard Dawkins, who needs no introduction. He is an evolutionary biologist, ethologist, and science writer, best known for his books The Selfish Gene from 1976 and The God Delusion from 2006. He was professor for the public understanding of science at Oxford University from 1995 to 2008, and is on the advisory board of the University of Austin, Texas. Next will be on my far left, Carl Heneghan. He is a physicist, academic, and researcher known for his efforts to improve healthcare decision-making through the critical appraisal of medical evidence. He is professor of evidence-based medicine and director of the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford, and he has been a vocal critic of COVID lockdown measures, writing regularly on the subject in The Telegraph, Spectator, and on Trust the Evidence. Next on my left is Anna Krylov. She is professor of chemistry at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, specializing in computational quantum chemistry. She's a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, and she has written and spoken extensively on the imposition of ideological constraints on scientific research and politicization of science. And on my right is Alice Sullivan. She's professor of sociology at University College London. Her work focuses on educational, social, and health inequalities, and she has written extensively about the conflict between scientific values and gender identity politics. She's author of the 2025 Sullivan Review on Data, Statistics, and Research on Sex and Gender. So let me begin with you, Richard. You have an essay in the recent collection called The War on Science, which I was just reading recently, where you begin with the Lysenko episode and then move to contemporary claims that sex lies on a spectrum. And you note a common thread between these two episodes of science denial, namely the human conceit that personal feelings can change reality. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Thank you very much. You briefly summarized my talk for me. Thank you. Science is the jewel in humanity's crown. I don't mean settled scientific facts. I mean the scientific method which approaches scientific facts. Science facts will be found to be true all over the universe, not just here on this one planet. It is not subject to parochial human concerns, either political or human feelings. As you say, I shall be mentioning the Lysenko episode in Soviet Russia. Lysenko was a charlatan. He masqueraded as an agricultural scientist. He was responsible for a major famine both in Soviet Russia and in China. Just read an extract. This is a quote from Sam Keen: "The Soviet era's deadly scientist is regaining popularity in Russia. Although it is impossible to say for sure, Trofim Lysenko probably killed more human beings than any individual scientist in history. Other dubious scientific achievements have cut thousands upon thousands of lives short: dynamite, poison gas, atomic bombs. But Lysenko, a Soviet biologist, condemned perhaps millions of people to starvation through bogus agricultural research, and did so without hesitation. He got the ear of Stalin, and everything else followed from that." In 1948, he convened a conference which was, the proceedings of which were published in English under the rather innocent-sounding title, "The Situation in Biological Science Today," and he extolled on purely political grounds a bogus scientific doctrine of inheritance of acquired characteristics. I won't read out all the chilling denunciations of Western, or what one would call Western, of simply genetics, which he perpetrated, and all his acolytes did as well. I'll just read a couple of the even more chilling confessions of orthodox geneticists who were intimidated into climbing down. Here's one from S.I. Alekanian. "When I leave this session, the first thing I must do is to review not only my attitude towards the new Mishorinian science, but my entire earlier activity. I call upon my comrades to do likewise. From tomorrow on, I shall not only myself, but in all my scientific activity, try to emancipate myself from the old reactionary Weissmann, Morganian, that just means genetics, views, but shall try to reform and convince all my pupils and comrades." In a second statement by P.M. Zhukovsky, "I admit that the position I held was wrong. A sleepless night held me think over my behavior. Let the past which has divided me from T.D. Lysenko be forgotten. Believe me that I take this step today together as a party member, a sincere member of our party," and that is honestly applause. Let us hope those two penitents escape the fate of Vavilov, the genuinely distinguished botanist and geneticist who eventually died in prison on trumped-up charges of espionage. The second of my examples of the subversion of science by political or human feeling interests is the absurd idea that sex is non-binary. A woman can be a woman who is whoever declares himself to be a woman. A quote from the leader of the Liberal Democrats demonstrates how influential this view has become. He said, "A woman can quite clearly have a penis." A couple of quotations from newspapers, British newspapers. "She is accused of 4 counts of engaging in sexual activity in the presence of a child and 2 counts of exposure where she intentionally exposed her penis." And then from the Times, "A transgender woman has denied raping 2 women with her penis as she went on trial in the High Court in Glasgow." We're all familiar with the number of cancellations that have affected people who have succumbed to this kind of nonsense. I'll read a couple from Andrew Doyle's recent book, Woke Racism. In 2018, the barrister Alison Bailey, a lesbian with a long history of gay activism, raised concerns about her Chamber's decision to join Stonewall's program. As a result, she was labeled as transphobic by her chambers, which publicly announced that she was under investigation. In 2018, the children's author Rachel Rooney published a book called My Body Is Me. It was branded transphobic. She was subject to a campaign of harassment by figures in the publishing industry. Some bookshops capitulated to activists and stopped stocking her work. By the way, I've lost count of the number of publishers who told me that they've succumbed to pressure from young members of their organization to suppress books. And if you ever come across an otherwise sensible scientist who seems to be spouting gender-based nonsense, my advice is cherchez les enfants. You will find that he is sucking up to his own children. In 2021, the actor James Dreyfus was dropped from the audio range of Doctor Who stories for signing a letter to Stonewall, calling for an open and respectful debate on the subject of gender identity ideology. The company not only dropped him, but erased his episodes from a compilation. He called for discussion and was cancelled for that reason. Well, enough on cancellation. Let me say a little bit about why this is all nonsense. Sex is as binary as they come. I am the author of an article in New Statesman a few years ago called The Tyranny of the Discontinuous Mind, when I advocated continua wherever you look. For example, in university class lists, we divide students into first, second, third, or 2-1, 2-2, etc., ignoring the fact that the top of one class is much more distant from the top of the class above than from the bottom of the class above. So dividing students into first, second, and third, when you've got a perfectly good continuum of marks, is, in a way, wicked. Talking about Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, etc., dividing people into age categories when actually age is a continuum, is a false division, a false exercise of the discontinuous mind. Talking about how many people are below the poverty line. Poverty is a continuum, there's no line. So I'm on record as being anti-discontinuities, and yet the one place in biology where we really do have a discontinuity is sex. There are two sexes, there are no intermediates. The discontinuity between male and female is based upon gamete size. This applies all through the animal and plant kingdoms. The only exceptions are certain fungi and algae, which are not animals or plants. But it's a universal feature of all biology that there are two sexes, one of the very few discontinuities that we have. And yet we are in the midst of a remarkably influential orthodoxy reaching to the highest levels, which states that there is a continuum of sexes, hundreds of sexes in some cases, and people have been cancelled because of their departure from this. The source of this nonsense seems to be the academic philosophy of postmodernism. I'm not entirely clear what this means. I suspect that postmodernists aren't clear either. Their language is so obscure that it's hard to tell. Alan Sokol, who is here today, has summarized it as so-called scientific knowledge does not, as it applies to science, so-called scientific knowledge does not in fact constitute objective knowledge of a reality external to ourselves, but it is a mere social construction on a par with myths and religions, which therefore have an equal claim to validity. And he illustrates it with some remarkable quotations from the various commentators on the sociology and philosophy of science. Harry Collins: the natural world has a small or non-existent role in the construction of scientific knowledge. Can you believe that? And this one, equally astonishing, from another social scientist Kenneth Gergen, the validity of theoretical propositions in the sciences is in no way affected by factual evidence. Science is no more than a social construct. It would be rather like repealing the laws of thermodynamics in order that we shall have perpetual motion machines. Evidence is the only reason to believe anything about the real world. The scientific method is the only way to get such evidence. If a better method came along, science would adopt it. If your science is so weak that the best you can do is yell that your opponent is a Mendelist, Morganist, or Weissmanist, that would be a slogan from Lysenko, or a transphobic bigot, or a TERF, or a full-on MAGA outright Trump supporter, you've already lost the argument. Sometimes the name-calling goes further and becomes overtly threatening. In Lysenko's case, very obviously and tragically so. At a London Pride demonstration in 2023, Sarah Jane Baker, previously Alan Baker, told a cheering crowd, "If you see a TERF," that's trans exclusionary. Thank you, I'm glad I got that wrong. If you see a TERF, punch them in the fucking face. I don't think I'm unduly guilty of sexist stereotyping if I say that such language is more typical of the sex that Sarah Jane claims to have left than the one she aspires to join. A position should be supported or refuted by rational discussion informed by evidence. People who terminate an argument by resorting to threats or name-calling are ignominiously signaling that they've lost the argument. Like Lysenko. It took decades and the death of Stalin for Russia to see through Lysenko. Let's hope we, in our century, don't take quite so long to come to our senses.
Thank you. So one of the things that we just heard was Lysenko's science denial led to lots of deaths. And that moves me to the next, I want to move to Carl Heneghan and to the suppression of scientific discourse during one of the most significant events in recent history, the COVID pandemic, which of course led to lots of deaths. And Carl, you have argued that censorship by social media platforms, government groupthink, and journals taking political lines narrowed the range of debate. So could you walk us through some of those episodes and what were the consequences?
Yeah, certainly, thanks. It's 15th of October, so take yourself back 5 years ago today. And just remember, at that point, London went from medium to high alert. And in doing so, people must not meet with anybody outside their household or support bubble in any indoor setting, whether at home or in public. People must not meet in a group of more than 6 outside, including in a garden or other space, and you should reduce the number of journeys and people you contact with. Now, in the light of day, when you look back, you'll probably all have a tipping point where you start to question these policies and what was going on. You may have your favourite policy that you think was totally ridiculous. Mine was Nicola Sturgeon's, actually. In Scotland, they really wanted to be different to England. So they decided in schools that they were going to cut the doors off to improve ventilation. Until the fire service pointed out that was a really bad idea. And in doing so, you come back in time and think, well, it's absurd. Now, throughout that journey in 2020, we had over 200 different policies enacted. They were so rapid and so changing. There were 10 different mass policies. Nobody knew what the policies were. But in doing so, the ability to question government was what the issue was at the time. And so, thinking in academic freedom, one of the first things we did was change policy to move away from academic journals, because they are the fundamental censorship of freedom of speech. Because if they don't like the message, they'll put it into a terminal doom loop, they'll send it out for peer review, and they'll never publish it. So we decided to change tack completely and go straight to the media, publish with the media. Places like, say, like Spectator, Telegraph, many articles. Daily Skeptics was started by Toby Young here. It was started as a COVID skeptic, so there were many outlets to publish. So in the 19th of November, about a month's time from now in 2020, we published a piece in The Spectator which said, landmark Danish study finds no significant effect for face mask awareness. My colleague Tom Jefferson has been doing the research on non-pharmaceutical inventions for 25 years. Nobody has been interested in the research about MPIs, hand washing, face masks until COVID. We were aware, all of the randomized trials to that point showed it had no effect on acute respiratory infections, particularly transmission and particularly in the community, 9 randomized controlled trials. Despite billions of people having to wear them, there were only ever 3 trials started in the whole of the pandemic, which is a disgrace that this country didn't enact a trial. But in pointing that out and putting that out, Fraser Nelson was the editor at the time, what happened next is that actually it was taken down by Facebook and censored for being misinformation and, in fact, disinformation. What had happened in between is poor quality observational studies have filled the void, giving you sort of huge effect sizes that were basically unrealistic. But that became the CDC line, the WHO line, and that became the truth. Now, you know masks don't work because we enacted them from June 2020 to July 2021. In that period, we ended up with 2 lockdowns, millions of infections, and huge issues in terms of society, so they don't work. The problem is, as we sit here today, is actually they're being reenacted in the United States of America, in hospitals, in places like Stafford, are bringing back masks, despite the fact there's no evidence that they make a difference. So, an evidence-based approach, what does it do? It says you should use high-quality evidence integrated with clinical experience and expertise and patient values to come to a decision. Ultimately, what it does is try to reduce the uncertainty about the decision. The problem in the pandemic is many people who arrived at the stage with limited experience or expertise had a solution to the highly complex problems. In doing so, it's much easier to enact a discussion that says, well, just in case, let's be cautious. Wear a mask just in case. Now, those people who arrive come at a point where they buy into the fear and the anxiety of the individuals. Today, there are still some people who are so highly anxious that they won't step outside the room without wearing a mask. So the second principle that we learned was you have to understand that emotional wave. And one of my colleagues and good friends is Johnny Ionardis in Stanford. And he went very early, in about end of April, May, and made a statement, said, I've looked at the evidence and the infection fatality ratio here is much less than everybody's doing. Actually, you can see the trajectory into the elderly. This is no problem for young people. He got pilloried for that. And that's because in any argument or where we come to a position, there's a disconnect, but people's emotions are so high, they can't deal with the evidence. They can't actually deal with what you were saying there as a truth until that emotional wave comes out. I think that's what we were hearing this morning, when you're having to say, are we starting to see a move and a shift? Then you can really come in with the connected arguments. Now, the point, though, is academic freedom says that basically you'll be able to go about your job, say what you like, and be able to be free from threats to your job, and opportunities won't be limited to you. That's utter nonsense, actually. We have to accept that actually there will be threats to your job. Myself, my colleague Sunetra Gupta at Oxford, huge number of complaints, all wanted to chuck us outside of our jobs and get us dismissed. We don't like what you're saying. Now, the problem is when you think about it, the problem again comes that you have to get to a certain level to be able to overcome those threats. And this is the problem for the younger generation, is they're sat there going, well, there are threats to my opportunities, there are threats to my jobs, and I can't see many rewards. And so often the people who are prepared to speak out have gone beyond that sort of curve, if you like, and said, actually, Now I can speak out because I've hit all the metrics, all of the things I need to do, and actually we can get to the truth. So there are no academic rewards right now for speaking out. You certainly will not get yourself into the knighthood realms or anything like that because you're not part of the establishment. So everybody in this room will recognize that. So where do the incentives and drivers come from? Now, this issue didn't stop. It was still occurring to us in 2022. We looked at the deaths. I've done a lot of work on the deaths, complete misinformation. The ability of us to produce accurate statistics is almost zero. We showed that actually at one point you could never die from COVID, and that was because if you'd have ever had a positive test, Public Health England, and you died, despite the fact there could be 2 years in between those two events, you would have died of COVID. But we also looked at how death was attributed. So one of the basic principles of epidemiology is the definitions you use. We found, through Freedom of Information requests, we looked at over 800, there were 14 different ways of counting a COVID death. To the point that in a care home, that you could assign on the death certificate, this is a COVID death with nothing else, no positive tests, no nothing, and never seen a doctor, and that was okay. We published that and said, well, this is a mess. We're certainly overcounting deaths, and we're using it to our advantage, and people are incorrectly assigning deaths. What happened is the Daily Mail published a piece about that. I retweeted that piece, and immediately my tweets got taken down. In doing so, again, you're in the misinformation, because you may be spreading misinformation about COVID and deaths and numbers that are coming out of official organisations. And I just wanted to think about a point then is I got approached by Big Brother Watch and said, we think there's going something on in government that they're monitoring people. So I sent subject access requests, freedom of information requests to the Cabinet Office and all sorts of bits across government, realising then got requests back that said, here's where we've been monitoring you. We have a counter-disinformation unit, we have a rapid response unit. And what is happening is governments increasingly, in trying to find simple solutions to complex problems, that as a rule of thumb are always wrong, are increasingly concerned about the fact people are bypassing usual structures of information. I've heard it this morning where they can go. For instance, I run a Substack, I'm aware Richard runs a Substack, where you can go directly to people who are countering the narrative. And that is increasingly difficult now for governments to deal with. So my main point is we need to change the rewards around academic freedom. And also what you need to do is develop experience and expertise in communication. Because you have to provide much more sophisticated arguments when you're coming at a problem for which people are highly emotive and know very little about what they're on about. In doing so, it takes lots of practice. I'd had practice because about 7 years ago, we did a program with Panorama and published the evidence on transgender use of puberty blockers in children. And we did a whole review, published the review, and said, there's a huge hole here. All I see is harms and no benefits. In doing so, I ended up on the front page of the Oxford Student as a transphobe. And realising the job, I'm also as a doctor and work as an urgent care GP, is the doctor's responsibility is to be the regulator when people want to do all sorts of things that can be harmful to them. And in saying this should never be prescribed unless it was in the confines of a trial or in research, we were considered as, again, disinformation and transphobe. But trying to say, actually, our job is to allow people to make better decisions, and in doing so, inform that decision. The ultimate problem with policy is it wants to make the decisions and then pull the evidence to it to suit that narrative. In doing so, it can find many academics who ideologically are conflicted or will see being part of the establishment a way to support that argument. So the answer is to provide more sophisticated ways of training people to communicate and trying to get reward incentives for those particularly young careerists who are prepared to speak out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to now shift slightly to a more broader view of mechanisms, how scientific censorship operate. So Anna, you have written extensively on the politicization and mechanisms of scientific censorship. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So what is interesting is today censorship in the sciences is administered mostly by scientists themselves. That is, by reviewers through peer review, by editors of the journals, by hiring committees, by funding agencies, and also by institutional review boards. So this censorship is of soft variety. And sometimes it's hard to document and detect because it can disguise very effectively under the guise of technical criticisms. So how does it manifest? There are many ways. One is in paper retractions. In our essay, in the World Science on Science Ontology, we have long litany of examples of papers retracted under different pretexts. I will give you two examples. Psychologist Michael Bailey, his paper on gender dysphoria that questioned efficiency of gender-affirming care for minors was retracted from a Springer journal in response to social media outcry. Another example, astronomer John Cormendy. He self-retracted his paper in which he proposed metrics to evaluate future merit of hires in the field of astronomy. Because the idea that merit exists and can be evaluated enraged critical social justice activists. Another form of censorship are barriers that authors can face if they publish unpopular opinions or findings, if they wish to publish this, or comments on published papers, if their critiques come from the wrong side of history. A couple examples. The journal Physics Review Physics Education Research published a paper titled Observing Whiteness in Introductory Physics, a case study. So the authors analyzed the physics lesson and how it is full of white supremacy. So they mentioned white boards as an exhibit of whiteness. So four physicists submitted a well-argued critical response comment on this paper to the journal, which is a standard practice in science publishing. The editors rejected the comment on the grounds that it was, quote, framed from the perspective of a research paradigm that is different from the one of the research being critiqued, end of quote. So, and what it means in plain language is that the authors used scientific approach to criticize the paper written from critical race theory framework. And the editor said that it's necessary to first accept the author's framework prior to offering a critique. So that is like to require physicists, astronomers to accept astrology as being true before allowing them to criticize it. So another example is from chemistry. The Journal of Chemical Education published a paper describing, quote, a special topic class in chemistry on feminism and science as a tool to disrupt the disconscious racism in STEM, end of quote. I do not know what that means, but they explain that the class explores, quote, the development and interrelationship between quantum mechanics, Marxist materialism, Afrofuturism, pessimism, and post-colonial nationalism. End of quote. I still do not know what that means. So my favorite part of this paper is where they explain that they used the Copenhagen interpretation of the collapse of wave-particle duality to problematize time as a linear social construct. Now, I do quantum mechanics for a living, so I know what that means, and it's like sheer nonsense. So, two chemists wrote a critical comment on this woke piece of scholarship, pointing out its multiple flaws. The obstacles they faced were unbelievable. Now, I know about them because I was one of the reviewers, and the editors even tried to censor my referee report. A version of the critique was ultimately published, but in severely redacted form. So publishing, I'm speaking from my experience, publishing unpopular viewpoint is an uphill battle. As the story of our paper, In Defense of Merit in Science, illustrates. We ultimately published it in a journal of controversial ideas. So the existence of such journal is a testimony of widespread censorship. So censorship is often disguised under pretexts. But the publishers now become much more brazen about it and institutionalize censorship in their censorious policies. Since we are in the UK, I will use a local example. In 2023, the Royal Society of Chemistry issued guidelines to its editors, I was one of the editors of a journal, to help us to identify and prevent the publication of inappropriate content. By inappropriate, they meant content that may cause offense. And in their guidelines, they emphasized that, quote, it is the perception of the recipient that determines offense, regardless of author's intent, end of quote. Now then, they helpfully provided 15 indicators of offensive content, including, my favorite, content that is, quote, likely to be upsetting, insulting, or objectionable to some or most people, end of quote. The Journal of Nature Human Behavior went further and published censorship manifesto, which begins like that. Advancing knowledge and understanding is a fundamental public good. In some cases, however, potential harms to the population studied may outweigh the benefit of publication. And then they go on to say that more or less they will censor submissions as they see fit. So there are many comical examples of censorious policies. Many, if not all, publishers now have DEI guidelines for the authors, which long lists of proscribed words such as strawman, master password, brown bag lunch, picnic, field, dark times, black market, double-blind study, nursing mother, and smartphone. Another facet of censorship is compelled speech. This is when publishers, funding agencies, and hiring committees compel you to say something that you do not believe is true. For example, some publishers encourage authors to do citation justice. That is, to social engineer their citation lists to highlight work of underrepresented minorities, regardless of whether such work is relevant to your study. So what do all these examples have in common? These are examples of censorship executed by the peers. And in my opinion, it is more consequential than more familiar censorship by the governments. Governments in democratic countries do not have control over journals or universities, especially private foundations, but our fellow scientists do.
Thank you. So just to briefly continue on the last point you said, people might be worried about recent events in the US with the Trump administration attempting to maybe restrict research on certain topics like maybe climate change or maybe statements coming from US government officials about vaccines and autism and things like that. So would you say that could perhaps lead to some kind of worrying censorship, or what are your thoughts on that?
We definitely should be concerned about it, but I would like to say that what is happening is very chaotic and complicated. So I looked into some aspects of it. So under Trump administration, National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health canceled several thousands of grants. So I studied the NSF list because I'm mostly funded by NSF, and I did not find a single grant that sounded like legitimate science among this canceled. It was all about racist mathematics, weaving indigenous knowledge in physics, gender identities in chemistry classrooms. So this paper of whiteness in physics that I mentioned, it was citing NSF funding. So that's one aspect of it. Now, NIH list, National Institute of Health list, looked different. It was longer, and it had quite a number of grants on vaccines that, most notably, mRNA vaccines for respiratory viruses that were cancelled. So, Jay Bhattacharya, the head of NIH, explained that NIH will still fund mRNA vaccines for other diseases, but for pandemic-prone viruses, they will prioritize a different platform. Now, I'm a chemist, so it's above my pay grade to judge these cases, but I want to say that this happened before, when funding agencies decide that they need to rebalance their portfolio. For example, I recall when Department of Energy decided under Obama administration that they had too much solar. And then they culled a bunch of centers doing solar energy research, including ours. So there are more examples when agencies would kill entire lines of research through cutting funding. So what we should be concerned is how these decisions are made. So are these purely political, and that what is of course on people's mind about RFK and vaccine research and all that, and we should be worried about it. But I think we should allow for possibility that these decisions, or at least some of them, may be motivated by legitimate considerations. Too much of the same, cost versus benefit, and so on.
Thank you. Next, let's come to Alice Sullivan. In Richard's opening remarks, we heard about cancellation around sex and gender, and of course, you, Alice, have written extensively on this topic, and you have personal experience of censorship on this topic. So I was wondering if you could tell a little bit more about your own experience and your understanding of these issues, how they play out on campus.
Thank you. Yeah, I became very aware of this issue on sex and gender, I guess around 2017, when the UK government launched a consultation into their plans for gender self-identification. Now, this was a proposed policy change that had really important implications for women's rights, women's sports, women's single-sex spaces, and so on. And of course, lots of women wanted to talk about it. But there was an absolutely vicious campaign to shut down any discussion. So we had the slogans, trans women are women, and no debate. So no debate used as a slogan. And I thought, I don't think I've ever seen this in my lifetime before. Men are women, and you're not even allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to question it. Women who tried to get together to talk about this were that venues were threatened, women were violently assaulted, people were thrown off social media, people were disciplined at work, they lost jobs, and so on. And at the same time, of course, there's this issue of transgender medicine and children, and people also wanted to talk about that, and that was also being heavily shut down. Now, it seemed to me that precisely in those circumstances where there is silencing in the wider society, universities have a duty to provide a space for rational discussion, and academics have a duty to bring their expertise to the table and share it for the public good. And universities absolutely failed that test in the most dramatic way. They completely failed to foster an environment where that was possible. And academics who spoke out, of course, experienced terrible harassment and discrimination. Now, around the same time, I became aware that we were seeing moves to prevent data collection on sex. Now, as Richard has said, sex is a binary variable, and it's a pretty important variable. For me as a sociologist, I don't think I've ever done an analysis that didn't have sex in it as a variable. It predicts everything, whether it's education, work, health, crime. Sex is always there. It's really important. So preventing data collection on sex, replacing it with data only on gender identity, seemed to me a particularly chilling form of silencing, because it was about making certain facts about the world not just unspeakable, but actually unknowable. So there's certain things we just won't be able to find out. And what we were seeing was, let's replace our binary variable, are you male, female, with something like, do you identify as man, woman, non-binary, or other? So that kind of thing was becoming quite commonplace in data collection. And specifically, and most worryingly, the Office for National Statistics actually joined in with this. And I found that completely shocking. So they were, in the run-up to the 2021 census, planning to change the guidance for the sex question. And sex has always been in the census since the inaugural census in 1801. We've always had sex because everyone has always known that sex is very important. And they were planning to change the guidance so that people could answer it essentially how they liked if their identity didn't match their sex. I had to speak out at that point. So I organised a letter of social statisticians, quantitative social scientists, writing to the UK census authorities with many eminent names, saying, look, please hang on a minute, think again. And I was naive enough at that point that I really thought that once it was pointed out that this was a bit daft, that we would sort it out, Obviously that wasn't quite happened. But an advantage that I did have was through organising that letter, it wasn't difficult actually for me to get my peers to not just to agree with me. I knew they agreed with me. I knew they weren't mad and they didn't think there were 5 sexes. But they did also put their heads above the parapet. So I knew from the outset, not just that I wasn't alone in my belief that sex matters and that there are 2 sexes, but that my colleagues were willing to say so. So that was, I think, a huge advantage to me. But it didn't stop me from being platformed and facing campaigns of denunciation and so on. But those campaigns, I think, really come from a tiny minority of activists, which makes it all the more shocking, I think, that our universities and our institutions have not stood up to them.
Thank you.
Could I just add a point about the statistics? It's not just that information is suppressed by classifying people by what they think they are rather than what they are. There's also an active distortion. Here's an example. The violent crimes are overwhelmingly committed by males rather than females. Now, if a male masquerading as a female commits a murder, if that is added to the female side of the ledger, it has a much more dramatic effect upon the apparent percentage numbers of crimes by alleged females than if it was added to the other side of the ledger. That's a statistical artifact which is dramatic.
Alice, just to follow up on maybe a more optimistic note, you have written this recent two-part report for the government, with the first part on data and statistics and the second part on barriers to research. So what are the main recommendations in your report about how universities and other institutions can better protect free speech and academic freedom?
Yeah, so the first part of the report very simply recommends that we should collect data on sex by default, and that yes, we may very well be interested in people's identities as well, and it may very well be useful to collect data on transgender identities in addition to data on sex, but we should not muddle the two. When it comes to academic freedom, so the review held an open call for evidence online where academics could provide their stories. And I thought that was really important because there are a few very dramatic stories that have been in the media that people know about. For example, Kathleen Stock's case. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, and there are so many academics who have experienced silencing on this issue. So I wanted to give them a chance to explain what had happened to them so that universities could actually learn from these experiences and what are the issues that people are facing and how can we sort this out. So academics had faced a range of barriers to research on sex and gender. So no platforming and difficulties in holding events are one. Ethics committees shutting down research, difficulties in getting funding, difficulties in the publication system, as Anna was talking about. And some had faced really severe personal consequences to their careers, to their mental health, to their well-being. And others, of course, had self-censored in order to avoid those kinds of consequences. And that, I think, is hugely important. So one comment, for example, was, I've seen what happened to Kathleen Stock and Joe Phoenix, and I don't want to be next. So they've made an example of some people, and it is meant to be frightening, and it is frightening. So I think a starting point and a sort of key recommendation from the review for university managers would for them to actually admit that there is a problem with freedom restricting harassment in our universities and to learn the lessons of the mistakes of the last 10 years. The last 10 years we've had university vice-chancellors and senior leaders saying, oh, there's no problem here, it's all, a fabricated right-wing culture wars issue. Well, you can't solve a problem if you won't name it and acknowledge it, so that needs to come first. I've also recommended that universities need to review their EDI structures, policies, and networks. And it's particularly, I have to say, those LGBTQ plus networks that have coordinated harassment and discrimination within our universities. We have to face up to that and tackle it. It is a tiny number of people, but they've been empowered, and we need to defang them. We also need institutional neutrality. We need universities to stop waving flags for fashionable causes and regain public trust. We've seen what's happening in the US with the backlash and Trump. I would like to see university leaders in the UK learn the lessons from that. We cannot take for granted that we are respected. If we do not pursue truth without fear or favor, we will not be respected and we won't deserve to be.
I just wanted to follow up on something you said. One point is that these cancellation campaigns have profound effect, and that's many totalitarian regimes knew this, how it works. You do not need to punish many people. You do not need to punish all of them. Just pick a couple and make a big show out of it, and it will go a long way. So that's very important. Now, the second point about what happens in the US and universities and institutional neutrality. So one of the very negative outcomes of this culture of, of politicization of science that comes through censorship, through institutions professing their alliance with particular cause of today, is the loss of public trust. Because when scientists act as political agents, when they do not speak as experts, impassionate experts, so then why we are surprised that people start to see us as political agents, and then they say, well, I just decide whether these political agents align with my ideology or not. And that's exactly what we see in the US. It comes through surveys that the trust in American institutions is all-time low, and it's much more damaging than any political perturbation that comes currently from the government, because governments change, but public stays. And if you do not regain this trust, it's very scary.
All right, we have about 20 minutes left, so I would like to go to the audience. We'll take about 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then each of the panelists can decide which ones they address. So, the gentleman in the front there. Pierce.
Hi, my name is Piers Ben, and I teach philosophy at Fordham University, London Centre. It's a fascinating discussion, and I've noticed in the science press there's been some ambivalence about political bias. And I noticed a magazine called Skeptical Inquirer that I read regularly came out in 2023 against what seemed to be the, quotes, woke bias of science. And I thought that was a very positive move. But the main point that's always worried me about how the debate would go is that what some people call censorship will always be what others call academic gatekeeping. So I'm sure that Professor Dawkins would not want a young Earth creationist appointed to a chair of biology at university. And if such a would-be candidate said, censorship, the reply would be, well, no, you're not being appointed because you're academically incompetent. The trouble is that's exactly what some people on the progressive left and increasingly on the right say about their own opponents. They say, we're not trying to censor people because of their views, we're censoring them, or we're not appointing them because they're academically incompetent, and there must be academic standards. Now, then it turns into a debate about who's academically incompetent, and the issue of free speech and academic freedom tends to get lost in that. There must be a conceptual connection between the two debates, but I've always worried about how the line is to be drawn.
Thank you. The lady next to Pierce.
Thank you, Joanna Williams. This time yesterday, I was speaking at a conference organised by the international mining industry, bringing together members of the kind of global mining community. I've got to confess I know absolutely nothing whatsoever about mining, but I was asked to speak about DEI and more specifically to provide criticisms of DEI. And this really stood in very stark contrast to the academic conferences that I'm far more familiar with, where it would be unthinkable to have somebody brought on stage specifically to knock down their arguments. The opening session of this conference yesterday posed the question, this was the title of the opening session, was, what is truth? And again, I thought that was a real stark contrast to academia. On the one hand, it's kind of bizarre the mining industry is asking themselves such questions. You think it would be obvious what truth meant in the mining industry. But on the other hand, it was kind of a real relief to be so explicit about this. And I think it's, again, something that's very missing from academia, where truth, even in sciences, is assumed and becomes politicized, and questioning truth then becomes a heresy and a real way of clamping down on academic freedom.
Can we go to the back over there? Yeah, just the lady. Yeah, right.
In the case of childhood gender medicine, I'm from Transgender Trend, my name's Stephanie Davis-Arai, but what I think is going on is not just the suppression of some research like Lippmann or the attempts to discredit Cass, but it's the strategy to produce study after study after study to prove the benefits of blood hormones. And these are really shoddy studies that don't say what they claim to say, but the scientific literature will publish them. So just want to speak something on that. And very briefly, what really concerns me is the indoctrination of children in schools into this. And Alice, in your area, we have surveys given to school children now that ask the question, are you a girl, including trans girl? In other words, in order to answer the question, you have to agree with the ideology, and these are very young children, so I'm concerned about generations coming up that are indoctrinated into it right from the start.
Okay, we are going to take one more round later, but I would like to ask any of the panelists to respond to any of the questions.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the question, where is the line between academic freedom and competence? It's a very important question. I serve now on a university committee at my school, which is called Task Force for Academic Freedom and Responsibility. So, and the topic where you draw the line, and how do you decide when academic freedom ends and incompetent classroom speech begins is hard to draw. And I think I can give you an example. It's really hard to decide how to apply it. And yes, we all agree that extreme examples about appointing flat earth professor in a geology department is not a good idea, but in most cases it's not so clear. And often what is looking like a consensus might be not a consensus. And my favorite example is story about ulcers, stomach ulcers, how people thought that it's all due to poor nutrition, poor dietary choices, and the scientists who came up with understandings that they are caused by viruses or bacteria, I do not remember actually, but they are not caused by diet or stress, had a hell of a time publishing his findings. Ultimately, they proved to be right, and it was important, but for some time he was treated as a crank, as a fringe scientist. So it's a hard question.
Come to the point on truth, I think that's really interesting. So one of the important issues is immutable facts. So if you come to see me as a doctor, it really does matter whether you're a biological male or a female on the basis of the risks and the issues and the illnesses that you can get. And so we need to challenge where do immutable facts, because the use of transgender and other is saying, well, let's get rid of immutable facts. And if we do that, that might be quite beneficial, because can I change my age, for instance? Because that's what, in effect, we're doing. We're trying to say, well, I'd quite like to be retired tomorrow. Can I draw my pension, please? And suddenly you start to provide a sort of preposterous approach to what we're actually doing. So I think we've got to fight it with this idea. The first is in truth. What is immutable and what isn't? The second thing that we often come to then is causation. That is the basic principle. Does A cause B? And if so, can we intervene to change the course of that? What happens is, though, that is most of the experiments and the evidence we produce is interfered with by bias. And we're so tortured by bias, we even run a catalogue of bias you can look up online. We have meetings to describe the 270 biases that can affect how we go about our research and interpret it. So the real skill in being critical is to understand bias, and when the facts you're being put in front of you are actually distorted from the truth. Often we live in an uncertain world where people want to provide certainty. That's what the modelers do, and the mathematical modelers. If only you'll do this, then actually this is what will happen. But actually life and its complexity, and particularly acute respiratory infections, are highly complex, highly uncertain, and as I've said before, there are very few simple answers.
The first two questions about how do we avoid discriminating against nutcases like creationists and things, without being accused of being biased, and what is true. Those can be difficult questions, but one thing that this meeting ought to agree upon is that at very least when we're making our decisions about whether to hire somebody whose opinions are a bit dubious, is let's not be intimidated. Let's not be scared of speaking out in the way that we've heard over and over again today. That's a minimal requirement, that you should be able to speak out clearly and based on evidence without being frightened of being intimidated for putting your head above the parapet.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think one of the things we've done in universities is be far too tolerant of people who have told us that they don't believe in truth and that they don't believe in science. And we should simply be saying, well, you've got no place at a university then. We have far too many of those people, and they do tend to find their way into the university administration and do great damage. On Stephanie's point about questionnaires and surveys being used as a way to impose ideology or to affirm identities instead of to collect accurate information, nothing offends me more. I get very, very angry about that. And we saw a hideous example of that when the Hampstead Heath City of London Authority did their consultation some years ago on the on whether we should still have single-sex ponds on Hampstead Heath, or whether some men should be allowed into the ladies' pond, etc. And it was all written in terms of kind of postmodern mumbo jumbo. It's completely unethical, and I think so many people have lost sight of actually what surveys are for. They are there to collect accurate data, and it's unforgivable when we see major agencies like the Office for National Statistics falling into those kinds of traps.
Can I just the notion of EDI is not going to go away. And one of the interesting is the Committee on Academic Freedom criticised Oxford because it said everybody has to demonstrate when they come for a job that they're actively promoting EDI. So I have a different view about how we should interpret that then. And I say I do it all the time. For equality, I find equality of opportunity is central to what we do. Not everybody, though, will take the opportunities to progress. As for diversity, everybody I interview, I'm incredibly interested in their diversity of thought. The best team comes at problems from different viewpoints and different ideas and different notions. So we're all over diversity of thinking. As for inclusivity, all viewpoints should be garnered, despite the fact that may disagree with my own views. Indeed, I know I'm doing my job when I create an emotional reaction in other people. Some of those people won't like what you do. Then you're doing your job. If you work in academia and decide to never create an emotional reaction in anybody, you must be doing something that is of zero significance to the population at large. Therefore, I think we should change the narrative about what EDI should be, and then say we're all actively promoting it, and here's how we're going about it.
Well, that will not work because DIs...
I think we disagree.
No, to interpret DI, we need to use Orwellian lens, and my interpretation of DI acronym, based on how it operates, operational definition, is that it should be read as discrimination, entitlement, and intimidation.
Thank you. Let's go back to the audience for about 3 more questions. Jonathan, can you go back to the back over there? To Michelle in the second row.
Michelle Shipworth, I'm at University College London. We've skirted around this. I think Ulrika sort of mentioned funding sources about EU and sort of the particular tracks that funding sources have gone on for quite some time. I would like to hear the committee's ideas of what we can be doing about that, because that feels like a difficult one for me.
Matt Ridley. Academia tried very hard to shut down the question of whether or not the virus might have begun in a lab, completely comprehensively called it a conspiracy theory, got it censored out of the debate. Nonetheless, we took the argument outside the academy lots of intelligent amateurs, and effectively we won the debate that it's at least possible, if not probable, that that's what happened. And yet there has been almost no recognition of that within academia. Not only have science and nature not even begun to consider that possibility, the whole idea that lab leaks are now a risk has been kind of dropped from the agenda, which it used to be there before the pandemic, which is really rather extraordinary when you think about it. And, you know, my co-author on this has basically been blackballed from an academic career because of considering it. So how is it possible for academia to remain hermetically concealed from a debate that's actually taken place in the public?
Over the back of the gentleman at the back. No, behind.
Hi, Saul Jacker from Warwick. Anna's point about how can we put this? Encouraging people to reference articles that they don't particularly want to reference in order to encourage representation. I came across this idea, and my immediate response was that this is academic misconduct. And I wanted to raise that point. We want to enhance academic freedom, but part of the flip side of that is saying we're willing to recognize that some things really are, well, I'm asking, should we recognize that some things really are academic misconduct?
Okay. Last question.
Thank you. I worked in government in 2020 to 2021, so I and my colleagues dealt with the ONS on the census question, and it was extraordinary how politicised the whole discussion was, and it really shook my faith in the ONS and other arm's length bodies, because I think, you know, on that particular issue, it was just insane, the conversations we were having. I just wanted to ask a question about the marketplace of ideas. So I've always believed that the marketplace of ideas, kind of liberal competition of different opinions, would lead to a better outcome, would lead to truth. But at the same time, the postmodern theory that Richard Dawkins has talked about flourished in a relatively uncensorious, if that's the right phrase, uncensorious environment. What happened? Why did these ideas thrive between the 1970s and 1990s when there wasn't actually a kind of big institutional pressure of censorship? And that then raises the question, is it enough to go back to the liberal marketplace of ideas today? Or do institutions, do academics need to have other interventions? I'm very taken by Alice's idea that we actually demand of people working in science departments and universities that they have a commitment to the scientific method. Is that intrusive? Is that illiberal? Or is actually that necessary in order to try and to change what is effectively a battleground of ideas?
Okay, we are going to get back to the panel now. So, who wants to go first?
It's certainly true when you talk about gain-of-function research that what's happening is technology has an ability to do things that we can't understand. The reason why people shut that down is this approach to certainty. And it's interesting, though, that the consequences for people who basically tried to do that, for instance, the Wellcome Trust director, Jeremy Farrar, was one of the leading people to shut that. The consequences are zero. And in doing so, what does it say to people when you're the director of one of the largest funders in the world? That actually you can have an approach so the people being funded see the way people behave and there are no consequences. I do think, and the issue going back is, I joined Oxford in 1994. In that era, there was a great sense that somehow we could get to a higher quality evidence base. There was an emergence of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, the Cochrane Library, a real energy about producing trustworthy evidence. 30 years later, I say, actually, we find ourselves in a worse position now than we did 30 years ago. Despite all of the internet, all of the information revolution, we're drowning in information. People actually don't even go beyond the headline. But the issue is, particularly in healthcare, is the commercial forces are huge. There's so much money to be made that actually it's hard to rail against that. We live in a world where the major thing is for you to get unhealthy. would like you to become obese. Then we can sell you drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, all of these drugs that actually will produce a magic solution out of the hat for you. In doing so, Novo Nordisk, their revenues are bigger than the GDP of Denmark, where they're located. So they have huge influence around these countries. Revenues in Oxford are now more than 50% private. So as we've got bigger, the risk aversion has got greater. In doing so, managing the message will become more important, because what happens if you're prepared to stand up against the Pfizers of the world, the AstraZenecas, and say, look, these people are not doing things in our interest? Well, then you've got huge problems. So we do have huge problems coming down the line because of the huge commercialism. The other point that I actually do realize is more powerful, though, than commercialism is ideology. And there are areas, I know Simon Wesley's here, like chronic fatigue syndrome, like transgender, that will end up with no research in them. Because if you go into that area, it is a cesspit of emotions and anger that will be directed to you. And you have to ask a question and go, is this really worth it? When actually there are 11,000 other problems where you're not going to get that emotional reaction. And so that's a difficult one. I think there'll be areas which become no-go areas if we're not careful.
To the question of why is that universities are not talking about things like lab origin of COVID and things that concern population at large. The short answer is that according to surveys, universities are not very diverse in terms of political leanings of professoriate, and in the US at least, the surveys shows huge imbalance. In most conservative departments like engineering, we have Republicans outnumbered by Democrats more than 2-1, and then it's all downhill from there. There are departments that are 100% Democrats, and then on top of that, some other surveys, including those done by Lee Jassim, my good friend, that shows that percent of radicals, and in particular radicals from the left, Marxist, anarchist, and so on, is much higher at universities than in general population. So we hear a lot of talk from DI people saying that American academies should represent American population in terms of their color and gender and sexual orientation, and that it's not there yet. Now, no one is talking that universities actually should represent American population by their views. And here I see huge contrast, and I think that what is explaining why what we hear from universities is so different from what people outside of academia think and concerned about.
I just want to come back on Munira's point about the marketplace of ideas. I've always really disliked the analogy of the marketplace of ideas, and that's because in a marketplace you choose what you prefer. And what people prefer and the truth are two very different things.
I'd like to mildly object to what Anna just said, if it was meaning to imply that we should have a balance of political opinions in universities, that they're just going out to make sure we attract enough black people or other people like that. We go out and try to attract enough Republicans into the... What we should be doing is going for the best scientists or the best whatever they are. And whatever their political opinions happen to be, we have to live with that. We don't want to go out and say, we need a Republican because we haven't got enough of them. And that's just as bad as saying we need a black person because we haven't got enough of them.
Well, we do not need affirmative actions for Republicans. It's not what I mean. We don't, but seeing such a strong bias suggests that we weren't going for the best scientists and that some ideological filter was applied, because it's very hard to imagine that such imbalance developed on itself without intervention.
Okay, I think we are out of time, so please join me in thanking the panel.